Continuing on from my last video on abuse enabling, I will attempt to give a better description of my mother's personality, and indeed her personality disorder, I would argue. As you can no doubt tell, it's difficult to talk on this issue. I could certainly get my thoughts in order earlier on as I made the summary of the notes for this video presentation, but actually trying to talk about it has pretty much made all of my thoughts and plans just go into disarray, like wind blowing away sheets of paper. I have decided to make this video today, as in several months after the last one on abuse enabling, because of the difficulties I'm experiencing now, I suppose. And in a sense, the biggest of these difficulties is acknowledging that some problems are intractable, really, because the people who possess them want them to be there, or make it inevitable for them to be there, simply because they want certain things that always bring about these problems. So there are people who engage in addiction, who drink alcohol, for example, to drugs, because, well, their minds are pretty much wired to attempt to procure the immediate gratification that these provide. And people who are very hedonistic will turn to drugs because they're just hedonistic, they're idiots. They don't recognize the value of their minds as more than just how should I say this, an overgrown mechanism meant to simply press a pleasure switch over and over again throughout their lives. In my mother's case, I would say that all of her abuse enabling and her, I would say, willful exposure to abuse arose as a result of her, in a sense, own psychological defects. And these psychological defects were arrayed in such a way and had such strength, I would say, that perhaps it was impossible for my mother to overcome them, and rather than overcome them, she turned towards them to gratify them, to gratify her defects. I know this sounds bizarre in a sense. Some people are virtuous. They always attempt to better themselves. I consider myself to strive for virtue. And some people attempt to pursue material goals. They look at the outside world, they notice that certain things provoke certain sensations in their minds, and they strive to generate these sensations by doing various things in the outside world without ever considering why exactly they're having these sensations, without trying to, I guess, build the theory of their own minds and understand as well as regulate themselves. There are people who, finding that certain things are dangerous, they become eager to confront them, but also other people who, finding that certain things are dangerous, they try to avoid them, they try to placate them. And my mother is the kind of person who wants to avoid problems and to placate the people who cause them. In fact, I would say that For her, this is a very extreme characteristic. And it goes hand in hand with another characteristic of hers that is probably the most difficult one that I've had to come to terms with, and that I'm still not coming to terms with, as you can plainly see. That trait is her helplessness, if I could call it that. But the thing about helplessness is there are multiple kinds of helplessness out there. There's involuntary helplessness, in a sense, and voluntary helplessness. There's helplessness because of circumstances, and helplessness because, well, because one is comfortable with helplessness, and even because to a certain extent helplessness for some people is instrumental, even though they don't necessarily see it that way themselves. This is really painful. This is really painful. Essentially, if I can describe 3 traits that went hand in hand, I'm not sure if this is an exhaustive list, but if I could describe them, that really come to the heart of my mother's defects that allowed her to be an abuse enabler. There's cowardice, which is trying to avoid, and if one cannot avoid, to supplicate to dangerous individuals, to avoid trouble and keep the peace, that sort of thing. Then there's, I guess, this helplessness, this infirmity. I should just spell out different words for it, because I'm not sure either of them really comes to the heart of what I'm trying to express. This, I guess, incapacity. In Romanian there's a term for it, neputință, which really describes it quite well. A certain feebleness and basically the lack of a willingness to confront one's own problems. That's really what I'm trying to get to, which is very difficult for me to wrap my head around, because I tend to be very determined to pursue problems when I encounter them, and as opposed to having a lack of volition, for me unwillingness really means being determined not to do something. But I digress. The third characteristic would be complacency that my mother has. She really is okay with her defects and doesn't want to improve. She doesn't want to overcome them, even though these defects themselves are keeping her entangled to her own abuser. And there's also, I suppose, a fourth defect which ties into all the other 3 pretty well, which is a lack of agency. You know, I'm sitting here and in my head I'm partly thinking about, it's as if I'm imagining myself really screaming at my mother to just get her to stop being in the situation in which she is, to get her to stop staying with my abusive father. I'm pretty sure that he's not, how should I say this, egregiously abusive towards her now that there's no physical abuse, or any serious psychological abuse, even though he is still fairly manipulative. But the very idea that I cannot get her to overcome her situation just makes me want to try harder and harder. And what I envision in my own mind is actually something that probably has happened. Yeah, this is something that happened at least once. And sorry for the interlude. I'll just mention this briefly. When my I was sitting next to my mother, and I just and she was in her characteristically passive state, just sitting there, not really moving much, as in not moving much, not as if she was unconscious or anything like that, but rather uh, just being. It's difficult to explain this. Just being very passive in appearance and very timid, and I would just ask her, really plead to her, why didn't she just want to engage in any sort of solution for what my father had done to her? Why didn't she want to take a stance against him? Or what exactly would she have wanted for me to do to help her, and why didn't she want me to help her at all? And I remember that I was in such pain over the fact that I couldn't reach out to her in a way that she would be willing to accept, that I didn't have my glasses on at the time. I basically just smacked myself repeatedly uh, with my fists on my head, because I just couldn't bear it, and I just pleaded with her to try to understand how much it hurt me that she didn't care about herself at all, and all the humiliation that she was being exposed to, and what she did as a response to that was just sob quietly for a few seconds, and that was it. There was just no desire for her to move out of a bad situation. And what really really terrifies me, well, terrifies me is not the right word, what really hurts me, because it just goes against everything that I would want to do, is that she is perfectly happy to go to that man and basically cling to him, to cling to the very person who is destroying her. As I said at the beginning of the video, some problems for some people are intractable if they actually want to maintain them, and this is what my mother does. It's damn it. It reminds me actually of something else. I mentioned this as well. There's this computer game that's very disturbing in a sense, because it involves a lot of giant insects and the character slowly turning into an insect. That's a spoiler for you, I suppose. That wasn't very popular for, I think, for that particular reason, in which there are these huge spider webs at one point, and there are people dead or well, half dead in cocoons that have been eaten or are to be eaten by some giant spiders. And one of these spiders is quite intelligent and diabolical, and there's this cocoon that the character passes by, and it suddenly bursts open, and this guy with should I even describe this? Well, I guess it is quite gruesome, so I'll skip the details, but the character begins crawling forward, and the protagonist can pretty much tell, after going in that same direction, that forward literally means right in front of the big spider boss, and it's pretty much obvious that if this guy is going to go in that direction, he's going to get eaten eventually. So the main character can stand in his way and block his path, but even if you keep the main character there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, doesn't matter. Even if you try to get the main character to speak to that guy that's crawling forward, he just ignores the main character, and the game doesn't really offer you any way to prevent him from actually going to the biggest spider and eventually get eaten, which is extremely disturbing as I found it. Again, this game did not sell very well for obvious reasons, and really, I, in a sense, I'm in a very similar situation with a mother that wants to cling to an abusive father. No matter how much I try to convince her otherwise, no matter what I could think of, no matter what I could do, it's just that her motivation, her, I could say defective motivation, just bids her to come back to him. And as I keep wanting to describe, going back to this, the main theme of this video, as I keep wanting to describe my mother, I think her behavior reminds me of that of the so-called borderline waif. The term borderline personality disorder is a clinical term used to describe people, particularly women, because these are the ones who are most likely to seek medical help, I guess that's how they would think of it, uh, from a therapist. So borderline personality disorder, these people tend to be so hurt by the idea of abandonment that they are willing to do anything, including lie and manipulate and throw huge tantrums in order to prevent people who are on the verge of abandoning them from abandoning them. And abandonment can sometimes even mean being left alone for a few days, or sometimes, in some cases, even for a few minutes. So, and that's not the whole of the disorder. That's certainly one of the main features. It isn't necessarily present. I think that there's a variety of features, 4 of which, if I recall correctly from the last edition of the DSM, have to exist in order for a person to be diagnosed borderline. But this is one of the main features, and the interesting thing is that there are different kinds of people with borderline personality disorder. In fact, the problem with psychiatric diagnoses is that they're all based on assessments of behavior, I guess, rather than any objective criteria, neuroscientific criteria. But nevertheless, I find it useful, that's why I'm mentioning it here. The borderline waif is a particular kind of borderline personality disorder person, I guess, that doesn't have all the I guess dramatic traits, throwing tantrums and having periods when the borderline person is very critical of their partner or the people close to them in any case, but rather the borderline waif is always very weak and always projects a need to be taken care of and to be rescued. I can understand honestly that people who had been abused in childhood, and many people with borderline personality disorder, not all of them mind you, apparently had been abused in childhood, but this is difficult to talk about as well. The idea of wanting an attachment figure, someone to bond with, someone who wouldn't abandon you, would naturally be quite important to such people. And I do know that from my own experiences, it can be very frustrating trying to find people who will actually care about you and bond with you. It doesn't seem to be a trait that, how should I say this, most people bear towards others, except for specifically, say, their parents or their own children or their spouse, perhaps. It doesn't seem to be that common, I found, unfortunately. So it can be very difficult and very frustrating, and I can understand that people may be angry with those who just abandon them. But in cases in which you're dealing with someone who doesn't want to abandon you, throwing a tantrum is really the wrong way to handle being left alone for a few days, for example. But in terms of always wanting an attachment figure to cling to someone, the borderline waif again really projects this helplessness and this frailty to encourage people, I suppose, to see her as, or to see him, I suppose, but as a little baby, someone who cannot, someone who cannot support themselves and thus needs to be supported, because otherwise she might end up in a really bad situation. So in a sense, she appeals to people's altruistic intent. But the interesting thing about altruistic intents, the very healthy thing I suppose, is that a person doesn't want to, how should I say this, support someone else in such a way that they maintain the defects that cause them to require support. So in my mother's case, her feebleness, her infirmity, it is something that she wanted support with, but it's something that she wanted to maintain. In a sense, she wanted to be this little baby that would be cared for. And again, I would really like to actually have a proper mother figure and a proper father figure as well, and be really cared for and loved, and just restore, or rather produce, a healthy familial bond. I don't see any problem with that. But there is a problem when you, how should I say this, have defects like this feebleness, and you just take them to the extreme. You want really to say, okay, I like, in a sense, being a little baby towards someone some of the time, and just having a nice caring relationship with them. That's nice, but at the same time you have to be willing to also stand up and take action, come to grips with your own agency, and be motivated to pursue your goals, as opposed to expecting other people to pursue them for you, and always sinking into this sort of helplessness in order to encourage them to do it. It's difficult for me to actually describe my mother in this sense. I think to give an example, at times when I wanted to do things for her, when I wanted to do things for myself, my mother would encourage me to just let my father do it, which of course I hated. I would have not wanted to do, because he was a scumbag, and I wouldn't have ever become dependent on such a person. But she was perfectly happy with it, with being dependent on someone else like that, especially someone who had displayed such gross immorality. Likewise, When I once spoke to her about how my mother would want the situation resolved with my father, she pretty much told me that she hoped that society would, how should I say this, pressure him into not being the way he is, really. And this is just reflective of her views on things, that whenever there's a problem, you should try to get a bigger person to solve it. And if incidentally, one of the reasons, I think the main reason my mother decided to marry my father, I might have said this before, was that he was intimidating. She actually found him scary in a sense, found him willing to impose himself, to push other people aside, as in just be a bully, and she liked that about him because she felt that she needed someone to pressure other people for her because she couldn't stand up for herself. And well, someone who stands up for themselves, they do evaluate when it's right and when it's wrong to actually stand up for themselves. As in, if a drunk guy decides to uh, throw slurs at you, you know that the guy is drunk. You know he's acting. How should I say this? Under the influence of alcohol. You just have to accept. Okay, I might talk to this guy and explain to him that he has to stop drinking so much after he gets sober. But I'm not gonna go and punch him in the face for having throwing these curses at me. Whereas a guy who just wants to intimidate and dominate, he's gonna go and regardless of that drunken person's agency, actual agency, not perceived agency, regardless of that guy's agency, he's gonna want to fight him because of the affront to his social status. So my mother, not ever, I guess, putting herself in a situation in which she could distinguish between I suppose standing up for yourself in a healthy manner and standing up for your ego, standing up for yourself in a very abusive and dysfunctional manner. She just wanted a guy who was the most willing to stand up for himself in any capacity, in any form, and that meant the guy was the biggest bully around. So I should probably make an extra video on this, talking about how the lack of agency can actually make you accept so many horrible things and be willing, indeed eager, to embrace the company. Sorry about that. To embrace the company of abusive individuals. It's really interesting. So basically, my mother liked my father because he was enough of a bully that he could get things sorted out for her while she just sat there and whimpered and went somewhere to hide, pretty much. All this gasping, I suppose, is flashbacks from all the times when I really wanted to warn my mother or try to desperately dissuade her from really taking cover from her problems when she ought to have confronted them. And the thing that's going on in my mind right now, I suppose in parallel with my thoughts on what I'm going to say next, is really wanting to scream mummy no, just scream mummy no, please mummy no, this sort of thing. And well, I would bet that a lot of people who have had to do with such an enabling parent, with one such enabling parent, with perhaps a borderline waif. I imagine this sort of thing probably went through their minds quite often. And the thing that really hurts about it is that as I'm halfway through saying it, as in my own mind, sorry, getting dizzy here, getting quite dizzy. The thing that went through my mind as I thought these things over, in after thinking mummy, as I thought, no, shouting no, the thought that my mother would be adamant to keep doing the things she did that led to continued experiences of abuse. Let me repeat that. The, as I keep thinking about my about saying mummy no, as soon as I begin to think of saying no, the thought of my mother just still going, still being perfectly intent on doing the things that destroy her, be they the things related to what I'm talking about now, as in clinging to my father, or at times, for example, going up to him and asking for money on my behalf, even though I specifically asked her not to do it, just seconds after she went to the living room to ask my father for money, for example, or things related to her schizophrenia, for example, shouting or wanting to go to the neighbor's door. I'll mention these things in later videos. I will cover them far more regularly from them. I think I will do them more regularly from now on, for various reasons. Anyway, yeah. Incidentally, I'm hoping that all these flashbacks, if you experience similar things, it just it kind of helps sympathize with yourself, because things that only you have experienced are, in a sense, difficult to understand from an external perspective, I suppose. So I hope that you guys benefit from it, and that it's not just, how should I say this, making the video overly stretched out. Okay, so just to get back to my notes, having spoken about how my mother liked my father as a big boss, to whom she could go whenever she needed something, when she felt too weak and helpless to do things herself. It's as if I really want to convince my mother with all my might, to inspire her and to plead to her to no longer be weak and helpless, to stand up for herself and be willing to overcome my father. I basically what really incidentally hurts me most about this is that my mother, she wanted to cling to my father and to, in a sense, love him. I have to put that in a sense in quotes. I would, because it really is hypergamous love, which is something I also want to talk about later. Um, yeah, hypergamous love, if you want to look it up. Uh, 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 I what really hurt me is that she wanted to form an attachment. She did form a one-sided attachment towards my father, and it hurt me that she always wanted me to also form an attachment towards him. In a sense, it was kind of like she wanted me to encourage me to develop this illusory two-sided attachment that was in fact a one-sided attachment, in which my father could just trash me psychologically or perhaps even physically the way he would have wanted to. Um, and that she wanted me to be part of a family, not just with her, but also with my abusive father, which is something that would have never been functional. Um, in fact, when I was 5 years, no, probably older than that, 7 years old, I remember my mother once telling me, I think it was in relation to my brother and I having had a fight, or that while my father was present, that we have to stay united because there are plenty of people who are against us. I would say that's partly, well, because the neighbors were quite nasty people themselves, and also because my mother had lived under communist surveillance, under the securities. That's the name, the translated name for the she had basically been under surveillance by the state security apparatus back during the communist era, because she had decided to marry my father. She came from a well respectable background. It was a communist era, so anything that was respectable, anything that was respectable back then wasn't really respectable. And she got involved with my father, who behaved in a sense like a dissident because he had views that were very far right. Well, that were quite right wing, I think, Tea Party level, as I mentioned. Um, derailing here, but yeah, she really wanted to form a family. She basically got this attitude of always being vulnerable and making herself vulnerable in order to get the protection and provision of an authority figure, because that's what she learned. Well, I'm not sure whether it's learned or inborn, but she probably got it from her own mother, who, I know her, she's also a very weak and I would say even limp person psychologically, who, how should I say this, tries to be nice and sweet to everyone, in the sense that she basically tries to be nice and sweet to everyone, especially, particularly I think if it gets her to receive things from these people. And I would imagine, from what I've seen of her, just making inferences, also having known other people, if it came to people needing her help and support, needing to be fought for by her, she would never ever consider it. She would just avoid them. She would avoid people who were trouble, in that they might have caused her any risk, or might have wanted her to engage in any risky activities that might have caused her any sort of loss. But she basically pretty much lives for self-interest. In her own terms, my father had bought her. That is to say, He made several purchases around her house, and this has discouraged her from wanting to pursue action against my father, as in her attitude is that perhaps things should be sorted out with just a kind of reconciliation in which someone else intimidates my father into not being abusive towards her. So the same mentality as my mother. And in fact, my grandmother, there's a lot to talk about here. My grandmother also said things to the effect of, he's the man, he should be taking care of things. And in fact, she was, in a sense, a trophy wife. She was taken care of by my maternal grandfather for the whole of her life. And she does behave in a very dependent, feeble fashion. I imagine she has done so instrumentally, or it's simply in her nature to do so, and she never wanted to overcome her own defects, her own lack of agency, and her willingness to submit to an authority figure who could solve all her problems for her, while keeping her in a little nest of her own, a little cradle, where everything would be taken care of and she wouldn't have to, do anything that wasn't nice, do anything that was risky, where she would basically live a carefree life, a life of contentment and personal enjoyment. I think really, if you've heard of the term dependent personality disorder, I don't think that differs a great deal from the idea of the borderline waif. Again, psychology, psychiatric diagnoses, they're very nebulous because they're not, at present, I'm hoping in future years they will be grounded in neurological research. So I think that people who are borderline waifs, they generally just want to be taken care of, and they want to avoid problems, but they will gravitate towards the biggest authority figure around. In a sense, amplifying tremendously this hideous female vice, indeed I would even call it a female evil, known as hypergamy. So I don't naturally, the people who exude the greatest sense of agency, the people who seem the most likely to, fix things, and not fix things in the sense of, how should I say this, rescue them, but fix things in the sense of, I need to rephrase this, the people who seem the most willing to accept all their defects without trying to repair these defects, and who want to fix the consequences of these defects, which are to say, all the problems in the borderline waif's life that require courage and a sense of agency in general to solve. These people who want to solve all these problems, they are, or at least claim to be willing to solve all these problems, it's pretty much a given that they will be abusive. And why is that? Because if you're looking for someone to fix all your problems and make everything wonderful for you, and there's no limit that you put on yourself to how wonderful things should be for you, or you are always afraid of big threats to you, you're always going to look for the biggest person around, the most intimidating person around, the person who is the most likely to fight off other people whenever you need them to be fought off. And if you think in terms of fear, well, and if you think it's okay to be afraid, well, you're going to want a guy who is willing to make other people afraid on your behalf, who's willing to intimidate other people, and essentially you're going to want someone who can carry out violence on your behalf. So you're going to be wanting to engage in violence by proxy. If you want someone who is willing to, feed you with a wonderful life full of luxury and contentment that all comes from the things you are being given, not from the things you are building yourself, then you're going to want the guy who wants to be the most successful out there, the person who has the biggest worldly ambitions. In fact, I can vouch for the fact that my mother tried to inspire worldly ambitions within me, which I never accepted. I always pursued, I guess, spiritual ambitions. Personal ambitions in the sense of trying to develop things within myself. I'll go to that later. But the people who are really, really keen on getting ahead, on taking over, taking charge of situations, controlling the environment around the borderline waif that is completely helpless and out of control, they're going to be the ones who are the most domineering, who are the most coercive, the ones who push people aside in their pursuit of personal glory. They're going to be narcissistic scum. And that is what the borderline waif is going to be attracted to. So when I talked about intractable problems at the beginning of this very long and convoluted video, if you're out of control and you need someone to take control of everything for you, and if you're completely helpless and you need someone to keep on feed into your defects, never expecting you to stand up for yourself, but treating you like a perpetual child, you might run into people who are just very giving, but since you're not giving things in return, since you're never going to be there for them when they need someone else to stand up for them, since if you see them as being weak, you're going to withdraw from them, just as you might come to them when you see them as being strong, then they're either going to smell it, they're not going to want to do anything with you, or if they do, I guess, marry you, they're going to be so burned out, or marry or be your close friends, they're going to be so burned out by your constant unwillingness to take charge of your life, to overcome your defects, that they'll just, as I said, burn out. They'll just become unwilling or psychologically unable to keep doing it, or they'll just realize that it's wrong for them to keep doing it. So the people that you're going to be most attracted to, the ones who can perpetually feed your defects, lack of agency, cowardice, complacency, and I guess feebleness, infirmity also. These people are going to be abusive, and a woman who has these defects to the extent that a borderline waif has, she's going to prefer an abuser who handles and controls things for her instead of a supportive person who wants her to stand up for herself, as well as stand by her and be willing to fight for her and with her. And this is why I feel in some cases the problem of abuse is intractable. Now, I say intractable, that doesn't mean that until the end of time some people are always going to be abused. I don't mean it that way. I'm fairly reasonably optimistic about what the future will bring in terms of neuroscience, in terms of different treatments for even personality disorders, which are said to be incurable at present. But if you want to be someone's hero, as I have wanted to be my mother's hero, to rescue the borderline waif, the abuse enabler, it might very well be that that person will not accept being rescued. What's the most striking, is that for a very long time I've wanted to do everything in my power to put my mother into a situation that she would accept, in a situation that she apologies. Essentially, I could come up with so many plans. I have come up with so many plans of trying to rescuing my mother from her own defects, getting her to overcome them. I've thought of so many ways to try to persuade her. I've attempted so much, and she always responded to me with indifference, trying to change the subject, asking me to overlook the problems, because actually having to confront her own problems scared her. And no matter how gentle and harmless I was to her, I don't know. No matter how I try thinking everything I could do for her. When she refused, I tried thinking of every possible reason why she might be refusing, because she never spelled it out. And I tried to think of ways to overcome that, or help her overcome that. And like a lump, my mother just stayed in place, trying her hardest to ignore to distract me, and to protect herself in a sense, in a very perverse sense, from the possibility that she might have to actually step out of her dependency. I noticed as a rant, this has been so difficult that it couldn't have been otherwise. There's a lot more to say, and I'll probably be in a better position to say it. Even talking about these things in front of a webcam has, in a sense, helped sort them out. And incidentally, I do want to encourage people, just as a side note, that if they're trying to recover from experiences of abuse, well, they pretty much will recover eventually. I'm optimistic about everyone's chances here. Basically, one good thing to do, I found, is to try to verbalize certain thoughts, because what tends to happen is that by expressing them, even privately, just in front of a wall, you elicit much stronger feelings in your own mind than if you just think about these things. And these feelings can all be part of the recovery process, but I digress. The whole thing about my mother having these traits, lack of agency and cowardice, feebleness, complacency in these things, it she seeing her hurt motivated me to do my best to rescue her, and people with borderline personality disorder routinely encourage rescuing behavior from people. In fact, pretty much the past 6, maybe 5 years have been about me trying to rescue her. But not only do people with borderline personality disorder encourage rescue behavior, they also prevent that behavior from being carried out. Because, again, they're comfortable with having an authority figure to cling to. Unless you can become a bigger authority figure than the authority figure they're clinging to, and do the things they liked about that authority figure, which is to enable the defects, holding them as a person in check, they're not going to want to accept your rescue. They will show how helpless they are, but that helplessness isn't there because they're doing everything in their power to overcome it, but somehow there are external circumstances preventing them. It's there because of their internal circumstances, because of their mindset, because they cherish their defects, as opposed to wanting to rise above them. So sure, you might see the borderline crying and expressing how miserable they feel, how helpless they are, and how all they really need is a little help, that they're really not asking for much, but they just don't actually want your help to come to its intended conclusion. Now, the truth is that people with borderline personality disorder, they can elicit rescuing behavior for, in a sense, manipulative ends. And I say in a sense because, for example, if someone who has borderline personality disorder feels isolated from the person they are attached to, they might do everything in their power to manipulate that person into staying with them. Likewise, in my case, I cannot help but wonder whether or not some of my mother's efforts to complain about the situation weren't due to some fledgling efforts to understand that situation and to emerge from the experience of abuse, as well as defeat the abuser. I can't help but wonder if complaints about the situation were in part there to show that she was weak and helpless, and she needed me to be close to her. And to a certain extent there was, as there apparently is in many abusive families, a role reversal between myself and my mother that I'm going to describe 2 videos from now, I think. So she always well, not always, she did when she did need me around, I suppose, she would, how should I say this, or when she needed me to even feel in certain ways, not, this is the wrong way to say it, but whenever she wanted me to behave childishly, for example, because she apparently liked that about me being her little baby doll, she would really try to encourage me to do it in various ways, or try to discourage me from not doing it, saying things like, when you were smaller, you were wiser. Um, I think she said that to me when I was about 7, 8, maybe 10 years old. So when you were younger, you were wiser, this sort of thing. And she was very keen on, how should I say this? Oh my lord. Was very keen on me believing in legends like Santa Claus, even up to the 4th grade, because she wanted me, by her own admission, to be a little baby forever. So it's a case of not wanting things to change, not wanting the people to whom you've attached yourself to abandon you, even by growing up. Oh, there's quite a lot to talk about. So many things I've just glossed over. I'm optimistic that the next videos are going to be a lot more concise, each one addressing a specific subject, and I hope that even in spite of the whole difficulties I'm finding in talking about these things, that you'll gain relevant information from them, and if anything is unclear, by all means just mention it in a comment or private message me, and I'll see about making an extra video talking about the things that I haven't been clear about in greater depth. So thank you for watching.